but which were fought for by generations of our predecessors who demanded things like unemployment insurance, old age pensions, Medicare, and so on. And so they're into that plan, which they call the age of austerity. In some cases, it involves direct shock treatment. I mean, the hits that are coming in some parts of the world are really quite unbelievable. Let me just give you a few examples to illustrate on the continuum. Latvia has fired a third of all public school teachers. Just fired them, gone. Greece, living standards have already, prior to the last so-called bailout and austerity budget, living standards had already been cut by 30%. They're still going down. They're going to go down maybe another 20% until they're cut in half. Pensions are going down in the same magnitude. The city of Detroit has been told by the state of Michigan that it must close half its schools. Closing half of the schools in Detroit mean that one of the most impoverished, racially oppressed populations in the United States is going to endure class sizes of 60. That's what it will mean for children. Spain now has an official unemployment rate of 25%. That's the official government rate, and 50% for young people under 25 and under. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Now, let me come to some of the specifics closer to home for us. Because I said to you, the bank bailouts and the collapse of the banks was of such a magnitude that some governments have fiscal or financial problems to address. Let me put it in some perspective. Greece has a total debt equal to 160% of its gross domestic product. Yeah, that's a lot. Now, there are ways of dealing with it, by the way, that don't involve any cuts to social programs. For instance, you actually put taxes on corporations. You impose financial taxes on transactions made by corporations. You actually tax the rich. You bring the banking sector under public control, and so on and so forth. They don't even entertain those options. There's one approach alone, and that is to cut programs. And normally, you probably figured out I don't, as a general rule, quote central bankers. They're not my favorite people. But there was an amazing statement made almost exactly a year ago by Mervyn King, the governor of the Bank of England, that I want to read to you. And he said this before a House of Commons Treasury Committee in London. And this is a direct quote. "The price of this financial crisis is being borne by people who absolutely did not cause it." Okay? I mean, that's bang on. And then he continues to say, "Now is the period when the cost is being paid. I'm surprised that the degree of public anger has not been greater than it has." Now, I don't want to underestimate the degree of public anger because there was another general strike in Spain this week, one in Portugal the week before, and so on. But I also actually think it should be greater than it has been. And one of the reasons it hasn't been is because this con job that I'm describing has been operating. The idea that we all live beyond our means, we all got used to social services we couldn't really pay for, and so something's got to give. And I think that is part of the explanation. Okay, so if that's what it looks like, let's put Canada, Ontario, Toronto, and so on in some context. As I say, Greece has a public debt equal to 160% of the gross domestic product. France has about half that, a little over 80%. Britain has a touch over 75%. What about Canada and Ontario? How about 35%? Okay? In other words, you're talking about a level of public debt about a quarter of the ratio of Greece, less than half that of Britain, and so on. There is no debt crisis to speak of at any level of government in Canada. So why are we hearing the stories? And the answer lies in a concept that some political economists, I think rightly, came up with called competitive austerity. Okay? The idea here is, as governments in other parts of the world drive down people's living standards, cut their social services, reduce minimum wages. That's been a big move in Greece, by the way. They created 2 lower minimum wages. They cut the regular minimum wage by 22%, and then they created a youth minimum wage, a good 20% below that. Okay? In other words, they are redesigning the economy in a drive to the bottom as cheap labor and precarious work economies. That's why people who have established benefits and union rights and so on have to be constructed as the enemy. Apparently it's a terrible thing to have dental plans. Okay? Apparently to get, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks of paid vacation after you've been on the job for 10 or 15 years is offensive, and so on. So they're out there trying to stigmatize those who, for a variety of historical reasons, particularly in the public sector, have had a touch more security. Let's remember, a lot of them don't have that security. Half of the City of Toronto workers in QB Local 79 are part-timers. Half of the library workers who were on strike over the last couple of weeks are part-timers. Okay, they don't have the given job security and so on. But this is what we need to understand, that they're looking at their new lean, mean, competitive world economy, and they're saying, even if we don't have a debt crisis, we're going to create the culture of fear that believes we have one because we need to lower wages, we need to lower living standards, we need to get around environmental assessments when it comes to things like oil pipeline projects. Okay, we need to lower corporate taxes. We need to send out the signal that Canada is open for corporate business on corporate terms, social consequences, environmental consequences, the consequences for Indigenous peoples, all of that be damned. Okay, we're out to further that agenda. And so that's what the competitive austerity business is about. And of course, keep in mind, it's being matched in the private sector as it's being imposed by governments on the public sector. So that what we saw a month ago in London, Ontario, with the electromotive diesel plant, where the 450 workers there were told, you accept a 50% wage cut and a 50% benefit cut, or you lose your jobs. Okay? To their credit, they said no. Unfortunately, as was pointed out by one of my colleagues in the Globe and Mail last weekend, they didn't occupy their factory so that they would have a basis for resistance. The companies have moved all the jobs to Illinois, which has become a so-called right-to-work state, dramatically weakened union powers, and so on. So that's what the race to the bottom means, and that's what creating the panic around public deficits and public debt is about. Some of you will remember that when the Mike Harris government was elected in 1995, one of the first things its education minister did was a speech he didn't realize was being transcribed at the time, and he said, in the education sector, we have to create a crisis in order to impose change. This is John Snowballing. Okay, create a crisis. And that's what they're doing right now. They're creating this popular perception, and the mainstream media just jump on it. You know, no critical skills whatsoever. They just jump on it and repeat it, that we have this public spending crisis, which, as I say, while it does exist in some jurisdictions that they would have to figure out, you know how I think they should deal with, well, to be entirely honest, I think Greece should just repudiate its debt and say it's odious and refuse to pay it. But that's another discussion for another time. And keep in mind that as governments do this, they're giving very clear instructions. We were treated a few weeks ago in Ontario to all this discussion of the Drummond Report. Well, think about it. Okay, you bring a former CEO of the Toronto-Dominion Bank in first off to do your public sector review. But as Drummond admitted in a column he wrote for the Globe and Mail, he was given explicit instructions that the deficit had to be eliminated and that tax increases were off the table. He couldn't even look at that option. He couldn't say taxes on the rich, financial transactions taxes, what have you, could be part of the agenda because that was explicitly written out of the mandate. So that's how, of course, they get the conclusions that they want. They rig the game in advance. And so, as I say, I think it's really important for us to recognize the nature of that argument. Now, let me say a few final words about how they imagine all of this playing out and bring it increasingly closer to home in some ways. So the longer term agenda is the agenda in which a company like Caterpillar gets its way, in which workers do stick with their jobs for 50% cuts in wages and benefits, in which they make more and more of the public sector, low-wage, part-time, precarious employment with fewer and fewer benefits. As I say, they move towards the low-wage economy. But of course, also, the cuts to public services are designed either directly or indirectly over time to build up the support for privatization. Okay? In some cases, like with social housing, they're making clear there's over 1,000 units of social housing they're setting out to privatize in the city, for instance. But with other services, there's no question they want to do something that they've been experimenting with in a lot of jurisdictions over the last 25 years or so, which is to keep starving social programs for necessary funds so that the quality gets worse and worse and worse. You pay more for your TTC service and the quality gets worse. So they can start to really win the argument that public services are expensive and inefficient, and if we could just privatize them all, we would have, lower fees, you pay less, and you get Cadillac service. So we need to understand also that the privatization of social services side of it. They're also completely redesigning immigration policy, criminal law, and education. I think Nadia will probably talk a fair bit about the immigration side of it, so I'll just simply say on this that they have now made it clear at the federal level that immigration will be geared entirely to corporate needs. And again, if you can have migrant labor that is utterly precarious in the ways I've talked about, i.e. it comes in through programs like the Temporary Foreign Worker Program and not with any entitlement to long-term membership in and participation in Canadian society, that's part of that whole precariousness agenda that I'm talking about. But they're doing the same thing with education right now. The McGuinty government has on the table a document in which they say they will move 60% of all university courses online. Okay, that's the objective. They will obviously increase the workloads of people like me who work in the university sector, that goes without saying. They will move to, they're actually supposed to be talking about compressing the current 4-year honors BA into a 3-year degree program. Everything to speed up, intensify, get people out into the job market, and they make it clear, forget learning social sciences, humanities, critical skills for understanding and analyzing the world. We're going to increase both the specific job skills that are transmitted and entrepreneurialism. Why entrepreneurialism? Because more and more of us are going to have to learn to live on our wits, okay? And pretend that's entrepreneurial, okay? To find a 10-hour-a-week contract here to keep ourselves alive for a while. It expires after 2 months and then run off and find the next job and pretend that's being an entrepreneur. That's the sort of cultural shift they want. And then, of course, comes the crime and punishment, the discipline side of it. Because if there's one thing that all the austerity politicians are gung-ho for, it's more prisons. To build the prison industrial complex. And again, think back to 1995, again, when Mike Harris came in Ontario, one of the first pieces of legislation they introduced was called the Safe Streets Act. And the Safe Streets Act was going to make us safe from panhandlers and young people who wanted to clean your windshield when you came up to an intersection, to squeegee it, okay? These terrible threats to social stability. But the point is that what they want to do is create a culture in which if you live in any way outside of the disciplines of the job market, okay, and that's the key thing. If you're going to create economic fear, then you need to say to people, you can't survive outside of doing it our way as a disciplined cog in the job market. And anything else, you think you want to study Shakespeare, forget it, there's no job there. You think maybe you prefer not to work that way, but to squeegee people's cars. All of that is part of the whole disciplinary idea that we all have one purpose and one purpose alone, and that's to produce as very disciplined little units for private or public firms.